Okay, so this is the Babel Podcast. This is the second episode. This is 6 months after the first one I did with Sebastian. And I thought I was going to do one like every week, and I guess I got burnt out from all the other podcasts. And
you could do one per year.
One per year. I feel like I am willing to do a lot more now that we have more ideas. But, so I was in Boston, and I figured I should meet up with Jason, so... we're now recording a podcast. Oh, we're here.
Hi, we're going to try video.
Oh, yeah, we're going to try video too. And then Jason just worked with us to announce preset modules, not preset modules.
Preset modules. Pick your own name.
Yeah, I think, and we can talk about that too. But yeah, thanks for joining and letting me talk with you about this stuff.
Happy to be here. I
Yeah.
didn't have to go very far.
In your place.
Thank you for coming to Boston.
Yeah. I don't know what we're going to call the title of this thing, but it said something like keeping JavaScript modern. That's why I accidentally typoed preset modern. But I think we were trying to say that this is going to be a temporary thing, and so it's going to be the future of preset-env, because this whole thing doesn't really have to exist, but we want to test it.
Right.
Okay. I guess maybe we should just start with how did you get involved with doing this idea and
Sure.
And why?
Yeah, sure. So for me, the backstory is I work on the Chrome team as a DevRel, and one of the things that I find myself doing, no idea whether I'm supposed to do this, but I find myself doing is combing through traces and bundle analyses of tons and tons of different websites, and when I can get access to the source, building them and seeing what went wrong, combing through source maps. And so I sort of have built up a mental list, and in some cases, many documents describing the problems that I seem to...
The patterns that you're finding.
Yeah, exactly. And
this is real-world sites. So.
Right. So, like, for me, the things that I'm most interested in are symptoms that show up as a result of tools. Because it's less about, like, developer needed to accomplish something that was difficult and so brought in a big library to do it. That's pretty justified. It's more like if the tooling was doing something behind the scenes that the developer may or may not have realized. And so when that starts to impact bundle size or bring in code or change the output of something, that's where I get really interested in, because that's a potentially solvable at scale problem.
Right, because it is a tool.
Yeah, so. You fix the tool, you fix
all
every configuration that uses it.
Right. So like if, say, Babel like outputted something that was a little bit bigger,
right,
whatever that means, and you were able to fix that for everyone, right, then that's a huge size win. And then I guess your goal is to reduce the code size for all websites then.
Right. So like, and that's that. You know, if I had a personal mantra, it would be to make the web smaller, which sounds quaint, but if you look at it from the perspective of making the web smaller without making the web less feature complex, right, or whatever, like if you're just looking at ways to optimize the web in its current state, then that's actually potentially a useful thing to do. And so for me, like if I was to, let's say I got all these traces and I went to the companies and the people who were building those projects and I submitted a pull request to remove the little bit of code that got injected or whatever, I would have to do that a million times to have any success. Versus if I can identify a potential improvement in a tool that has widespread use,
right? That's
every little change is magnified, right?
Yeah.
A 200 byte output size improvement in Babel is probably terabytes worth of network bandwidth. Right? Which is kind of staggering.
Yeah, it is staggering. I mean, I don't think we think about that as people that work on these projects. You know, you're dealing with like these minutiae things, but it's like it does affect a lot. And maybe I think maybe as a community, we've been focusing on the code size of individual libraries and importing them, or frameworks.
I'm certainly guilty of that.
Right? I guess especially you, right? But then it's like only recently that I think more people have gotten together to think about the tooling, like bundling and compilers, and so Babel is a good example. Yeah. Maybe it's like everyone's focusing on reducing that one-time cost of the library versus the tool, which everyone is constantly using all the time.
Right.
Yeah,
which I always think about as like, if you remember, like I'm terrible at math, but the one thing I do remember is like the slope of a line formula. You've got like your static value and then the one that's scaled up. Yeah, y equals mx plus b. It's really easy to focus on that static base cost and be like, what's the size of this on disk or whatever, or like when I install a dependency, how much does it weigh? But that scaling factor is the one where when you've been working on an application for 3 years or 10 years, like that one starts to matter way more than any base cost you would have had. So like I think there's worth on both sides of that,
right, exactly,
but like, oh man, if you're looking for value, especially if we have this notion that we've underinvested in tooling, or that there's more investment opportunity in tooling, then that seems like a huge reason to go and look at that scale factor.
I guess personally I would say that it's lacking in the sense that usually there's a lot of activity around frameworks and libraries. So just even the fact there's the companies that support them, or they literally, I guess in some sense, own them, or there's conferences like ReactConf, VueConf. There's no like BabelConf or WebpackConf. And I was thinking we should do a ToolConf or something.
ToolConf, I love that.
Which would be cool.
I know who could be the band that plays at the end.
Okay. Tool. Yeah. That makes sense.
Good luck getting them to come.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess it's just like we haven't really focused on the tools, and they kind of just quote unquote work. And I think in majority of cases for something like Babel, like you don't really have to think about it.
Right.
And then there's the point where something goes wrong, and then you report the bug, and no one has any understanding of how these work.
Right.
And hopefully this podcast, and we do more of this stuff, is explain kind of not just like literally how it works, but the concepts of philosophy behind certain things, and kind of the struggles that we're dealing with to even get to solving some of these problems.
Right, because if you're building something that sits on top of these tools, these are your problems.
Right, and then we don't have ownership over that thing, because you just kind of hope that people like us have goodwill and are willing to continue to do this.
Maybe we don't.
Yeah, maybe we don't.
We do. That's right.
We do. We do. But, life gets in the way, or, I was just saying, like, in open source, like, anything could happen. Like, you get health problems, or you move, or you go to school, you get out of school, you get married, or you get kids. Like, all these things happen, and we're just relying on a few people to literally work on these things.
Yeah. The maintainers of the infrastructure.
Yeah, and that's just open source in general. But
and I think the weirdest part here is like for a gaggle of programmers and other folks, but you can just look at the programming aspect. These are really interesting problems.
Yeah.
So I'm always surprised when like, people don't just naturally gravitate towards.
Why is there not more people?
Yeah, it's just like it's meaty, like fun, isolated challenges.
Right, and it's like is it because they're so far removed from how it works? It's either too daunting, or there's just lack of context that you don't even know what questions to ask. And I think one of the most important things I've learned is like learning like how do you ask the right questions, not literally getting the answers, but like just being curious about how things work and getting involved, understanding the people behind the project rather than just using it. Like that's the whole thing, right? Yeah, that was a good segue.
That was a good intro.
Yeah. Hopefully that gives you, I think it's like that, what we just talked about is like gives you a sense of the things that we're thinking about. It's not always very technical. I mean, it is technical, but there are philosophical like implications behind those things. And it's important. Like we were talking about earlier for just like this idea of like the models that we have in our heads, and the idea that like the people that maintain these things have different models than the people that use them, and they probably have a very limited model of what, like say for Babel, like what does it do, and so, if we want to go back, like what is Babel? It's a way of like the limited view would be, it turns my code from new JavaScript to old JavaScript, which is what it did before, and that's still what it does, but like it's a lot more broad. So like you were mentioning earlier, it's just a general transformation.
Yeah, and even like with looking at the model that somebody like you might have in their head of what Babel means, not just as a body of code, but as like what's its purpose in the world is
for JavaScript.
It's something more than just like a code transformer, right? It is a tool that potentially enables developers who normally are required to work within the syntax boundaries to move beyond that, and to sort of express themselves in ways that are not possible if the only vector you have for producing programs is writing the syntax. Right.
And I think that as someone that works on it, essentially my goal is to somehow, how do you embody those models or values through the culture of the project and the things the content we put out and stuff like that, where it's like, if I don't want, Babel is not that reductive where it just does that. And maybe one of my ideals is like, how do we create this community or platform? It doesn't have to be Babel itself. That's why it's like I want to look beyond the project of a way of allowing developers to, like what you said, like if you think that you can come up with a different syntax, then make it. Or if you can't make the literally syntax, describe what the limitations of the current syntax, and you can be a part of this process of just generally TC39 and the whole making JavaScript better. And I think that no one's in that headspace, because I think we assume that, you know, like it's kind of like the whole, I keep using this analogy of like, you know, something drops down from the sky.
Yeah.
The JavaScript tablet of what syntax you can use, and I just have to, I'm stuck with it. I mean, not that it's really easy to contribute. It takes a long time, but I'm just saying it is possible, unlike maybe other languages where there is no option for you to do it. And if anything, it's almost like Babel is this like, not reaction, but a way of protesting against using whatever people tell you to. Because if you wanted to, you could create your own language out of it. Babel script, quote unquote. I don't think that doesn't mean everyone should do that. I'm just saying that you can. There's a freedom of doing that. And I don't think people are exercising that or understand that's an option. You just kind of get it.
Right, like Babel, the implementation is a source code transformer. Babel, the reason for existence, is a democratization of language design.
Yeah.
And like, it sounds grandiose, but that's very literally what the project is for.
Yeah, and I would say I would admit I'm not doing the best job of figuring out how to say that, because it sounds too like weird, or it's like, what are you talking about? Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you just think about other languages in general and what we use and just like how they work, it's very different, and JavaScript is different. Maybe we should embrace that. Before I mentioned before, like in our conversation about this Pandora's box scenario, where like, well, if we open the floodgates of people able to just do whatever syntax they want, it's going to make everything horrible. But it's like, maybe we've gone too far in the other direction of just, you know, why did a lot of the stuff happen in ES6 and now like optional chaining, even like CoffeeScript? Yeah. And that was because someone decided to do it. And then everyone adopted it. And it's like, in some ways, I tried really hard to try to align ourselves with the committee and the process. And that kind of limits the potential creativity of people, just regular developers. And I mentioned the Tools for Conviviality book. It's like similar thing. How do we allow just people, not people that have to be in a certain position to do that? It doesn't mean that everyone's going to be capable of doing it and we need mentoring and teaching, but like it's a freedom that someone can take advantage of that is not in like, I don't know, any of like Java or whatever.
The tooling that underpins JavaScript, Babel's job there is to make that more accessible than other languages. Yeah. Right? To make the language itself more malleable and easier to reason about to somebody who otherwise might not have gotten involved with AST transformations or whatever.
And it's like the rising tide lifts all boats analogy. And there's that balance, because the problem with everyone doing it is like the scenario where like you go on GitHub and it's a JS file, but like, you know, it's just random stuff.
Just append letters to the end of JS.
Yeah, every time JS XYZ whatever. That'd be funny. And like, what does that scenario look like? And maybe we should try it. And I think that's the experimentation part. But also at the same time, we need to make sure that the platform is stable. And maybe it's like science. It's like we need the thing, allowing people to contribute, and maybe there are good things that we can take in. So how do you make sure that people are still experimenting, but then not creating bifurcation of all these platforms or whatever?
Yeah. It's like at some point you either need to codify that there exists a meta language level and then the language level, and eventually we like to migrate things to the language when they prove their worth. Or we need to, you know, even if that's not codified somewhere, like make that a culture that we have.
Yeah.
It's just like we are all sort of working towards making a better language, but our vector for doing that is making other languages.
Yeah.
Or making extensions to our language, and just recognizing that like these are built to die.
Oh yeah, that would be. I think the idea of built to die is super interesting, and maybe that should be a part of our philosophy as a project itself. And I've heard of I think it was Brian or PhoneGap was supposed to be something like that, right?
Right.
And Babel, in a way, I mean, we can transition to preset-env. That is the whole point of that project. Like Babel will continue to exist, but in different ways. Just like in our lives, like, we change our jobs or what we like or what we're working on. And so for us, it's like before it was 6 to 5, right? Turn ES6 to ES5, and then ES7, ES5, whatever. But the assumption there is that if that's all you think Babel is, then you will never get rid of Babel because you're just always compiling all your code to Babel. But, the obvious thing, not the obvious thing, but the thing that's happening over time is everything is moving forward in some way. So the browsers that you support are going to change. You're going to eventually drop old browsers. Babel will implement new stuff. TC39 will add new syntax. And then the browsers will add in the new syntax as well. So once the browser implements arrow functions and you're still compiling Babel through Babel, then you don't need to. You're going to have, it would be in your interest to send less code because one of our goals is to have less code for users. Okay, so then what is preset-env? It was basically a way for users to not have to figure out when to turn on and turn off plugins.
Right.
Because of the way we implement each plugin independently, I mean, sort of, right? It's a high level. And so ideally, the workflow would be, right, that, when a browser implements a syntax natively, you should be able to drop it.
Right.
And you shouldn't have to think about when to drop it.
Right.
So hopefully Babel will just do that for you.
Right. So sitting on top of the fact that Babel evolved from being 6 to 5 to being a higher order tool end to end,
mm-hmm.
This basically lets you define something in the nomenclature of a web developer, which is like, I support Edge 16 plus
right.
and evergreen browsers, and takes that and generates the N at the end, right? It's like, we assume you're writing modern JavaScript, whatever the current spec version is, and we will compile it to, the best code we can given the constraints of all the browsers that you need to support.
Right, and that's a non-engineered piece of information, meaning that if you're if you're just the PM, program manager, or I don't know, the business person, they should hopefully know which browsers they support. If they don't, as an engineer, you should ask them and they should figure it out. And then that way you could even tell them, if we are clear about what browsers we support, we could potentially send less code and make more money or whatever it is, right?
Yeah,
or
I don't know about
the website faster.
I don't know about you, but I've definitely been in the position in the past where that communication of the importance of supporting any given specific browser or browser version was very unclear.
Yeah, I think so.
And it's funny because as developers, we have this tendency to, decry having to support older browsers.
Mm-hmm.
But I've totally been in positions in the past where, out of one side of my mouth, I'd be saying, it sucks having to support IE8. And then I would find out a year later that I was the only one left who cared about supporting IE8. And it's like, what? I've made work for myself, right? It's like, yeah, it's a weird thing to find out, but it's because there's a communication model that communication in place there.
There was no single source of truth or whatever about how that works. I guess that's present.
It's still recording.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it's alright.
That's fine. Yeah, I think a lot of times you assume, I guess, some of these stuff what browsers you support, right? It's just it seems like pretty essential things to know, but it's just there.
Right.
And sometimes what people will do is they'll use preset-env and then they'll find out it breaks and you get reports, but you know that you don't support those browsers, so it's that's right, actually.
Yeah, the system is working as designed because the parameters that you put into it based on your business data or whatever, mm-hmm. you had agreed to break those older browsers, right? It wasn't a technology failure. It was a common understanding that you would not choose to support those things.
Right. Yeah. So I guess the goal with preset-env is just how do we prevent quote unquote unneeded compilation. Right.
How do you prevent somebody saying, okay, I'm going to compile to ECMAScript 5 and then never going back to look at that again?
Right. And I think that, and if we want to go from the browser perspective, you work on a browser. So, right. I mean, you work at a company that has a browser. So from that point of view, also, if everyone is using Babel and they only use Babel and there's nothing like preset-env, they have no incentive to There is no real world application of people using native ES6 syntax because it's always going all the way down to ES5. And so the browser has an incentive to convince Babel to use preset-env, basically,
yes,
right?
Absolutely. And this actually comes even down to prioritization for somebody who's building a JavaScript engine.
Oh yeah,
It's really, really difficult to say, like, oh yeah, we're going to optimize how fast arrow functions are if you know in the wild that's 5% of websites, right? Like, or would you rather do that, or would you rather optimize arguments access in sloppy mode because you know that's 95% of
right,
websites? I see. And then it's weird though to think about, like, you have another option at your disposal there, which is to change the tooling that governs 80% of those sites.
Right. But it's like, maybe you don't think that's an option because you have to interact with another project versus just... It's kind of like, maybe a lot of the times we just observe the environment and we try to act on that versus realizing we can act on the environment, meaning talk to people, essentially, and work with them.
I mean, I've totally run into this in the past where I pull a trace of something and I have source access, and I can just change something in the source to affect the change that I need on that project. But in doing that, I'm limiting myself to, in terms of
scope, right?
Scope, like it's O1. If I can find a way to go a level further and to find the root cause of the cause that I found, now I'm looking at ON.
ON, yeah, right. Big change.
And so that's where preset-env is potentially a place to collect data that can then be used to shift the ecosystem more easily, rather than saying, like, okay, we've identified that Babel's producing, whatever feature X. We are going to go and we're going to do programming things to change that. Preset-env is potentially a slip layer for us to be able to say, like, oh, Babel's producing X. I can see why it's this browser version. We're going to just change the data. We're going to do a workaround to address that browser version. I
like to think of, preset-env is like the evolution of what Babel was in the beginning.
Right.
And that's an artifact of showing why Babel is a transitional tool.
Right.
Of, like, the fact that unlike every other language where you can just upgrade, which, although now that's not really a good assumption, because just an example of, like, the Python 2 to 3 type of thing.
We're almost there.
We realized that, upgrading is really hard, and so maybe JavaScript is a language where it has to be that way. And so that whole jump from ES5 to ES6 was a big jump, but we're always going to have new features coming down the line. Right. And so how are you going to, if the goal is eventually, if you needed to use that feature, that syntax, that you would choose to do it, and you do it in the most, efficient way possible, how does this tool help the whole community move forward? Right? Like, first, convincing people that this syntax is even worth using in the first place.
And even maybe arriving at what that syntax would be.
Oh yeah, even beyond. So that's pre-work, the whole stage 0 type stuff with the process. Yeah, prototyping. So Babel can help with that because we've established maybe that browsers, are we going to write that code in C++ and maybe it takes a long time?
How would you justify that investment? Right?
Yeah, exactly. And versus anyone can just make a plugin and share it with people. And it doesn't have to be on NPM. You could, like... one of my ideals is, like, our REPL should somehow allow you to fork the parser inline or something, just to test out some syntax, share it on Twitter.
We have AST Explorer, which is sort of like along those lines. I would love if the Babel REPL
at the syntax level.
Yeah, it was like a check. Oh god, yeah,
that would be amazing. Like, just like I want to see, like, I want to just feel what it looks like to have 2 question marks for the optional chaining. I don't know, like, just to see it. Like, maybe it's a bad idea, but I think that's, like, where we all get into the theory. Like, we all can talk about how, like, a committee feels very ivory tower-ish, but, like, we all do that too, where we're kind of just theorizing versus just, like, just do the work, which might not be that hard. We need to make it easier for our team. And then you can look for yourself, then you can share it with people, get feedback, maybe you realize it was bad, and then you can explain to people why I thought it was bad, and everyone learns why this type of thing doesn't make sense, and you can document that, and that's the history of, like, people have attempted this kind of thing. That's what we're supposed to be doing in every language, right? We're learning from each other. But this is within JavaScript itself. So
yeah, so instead of having discussions where we trade theories and ideals, we could have discussions where we trade prototypes.
Right. Yeah. I guess that's a whole tangent. But that was the purpose of Babel. That's the purpose of Babel, even if you don't use Babel as literally the artifact tool that you didn't install it on npm.
Right.
Babel should be still important to you if you care about JavaScript, or maybe even if you want to go more meta, like programming language design or something.
Right.
In a different way. I mean, it doesn't mean that is the best way or the right way. That's just one way that it's playing out, and maybe we should experiment that. Yeah, so we do the pre-work of before the language is done, Babel helps with that. Then once it is stage 4 and it's in the language, you don't know if you can use it immediately based on your browsers. So that's literally what preset-env will help you. If you support a browser that does support it, then Babel will not compile it.
Right.
It won't touch it. But if you have an old browser, then it will compile it down, and you don't have to worry about it. And then later, when you decide to change your browser to move forward, then it will also drop it and not compile it. And so that way, and theoretically, the ideal situation, you just use it and nothing, and you don't have to think about anything. You just write your code, right?
To me, the ideal for preset-env was always that percentage, right? Where it's like, preset-env has a rough estimate of browser market share. You just say, hey, I want my stuff to work in 98% of browsers, and that's the config. Right?
I see, yeah.
But then I think this is where we run into that situation of like, there are browsers that are taking a very, very, very long time to upgrade or to go away. And this is, I think, one of the things that preset-env might have predicted a little bit, but the way that it played out was unfortunate in that it killed off some of the value that percentage
that way of configuration
had, right?
Yeah. I didn't come up with that idea because I thought that the per browser and the version idea made more sense to me because I was thinking from the PM program manager.
You have a browser support matrix,
right?
Put that in.
They already have that. Versus like the percentage thing is like no one thinks in that way. Even though it makes
percentage
sense.
of what though?
Yeah. And then also like and I guess now there are more browsers, right? Some of them are based on Chrome or whatever, like, and also in different countries and all these. I mean, there's mobile browsers, like which ones that you're supporting. That whole thing is, that matrix is already difficult. That's that's the problem.
There's a weird permutation problem there, where if you say you want to support 98% of browsers, it might be that means you could drop IE11 but support a bunch of very, very small market share browsers, or you support all the smaller market share browsers and keep IE11. And really, if all you specify is a percentage, who decides that?
Right. It would be the browserless maintainers.
I guess, yeah. But that's just like super, super arbitrary.
Right, yeah.
If you're deploying for enterprise in North America, it turns out you probably wanted IE11.
And I guess even that gets into the issue of preset-env that we're going to talk about, which is that there's just a lot that we don't know.
Yeah.
Like, maybe when you think about browsers, you just think about like Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and then I guess like Edge or something like that, right? And then, or Internet Explorer. And then later you're like, oh, there's all the mobile browsers. Oh, and then now there's like the app browsers, which is a whole nother thing, right? And
Facebook's
then
WebView,
Facebook's, Instagram, yeah. Or IoT type stuff and all these things. And it's like, how does that affect the support matrix of Babel? And then eventually maybe all those things are really old and then it's the same thing. The worst case scenario of using preset-env is that it just compiles everything, right?
Right.
So let's go into the problems, I guess, of what we've realized are problems that we didn't know up front because we wouldn't have understood the implications.
Right.
Yeah.
So we touched on one, which was you have browsers that are not evergreen but that don't go away, like the IE11s of the world.
Which prevents... Oh, so we have to explain the conservative approach of preset-env.
Which is specifying your browser versions?
Meaning that when you make that list of versions, it does the least common denominator.
Right, yeah. So, and this comes back. So, Babel can make no assumption other than you will produce one set of JavaScript files and ship them to everyone, right? Because it is a tool that runs per module right now.
Right, and it makes sense that you would want to make multiple bundles or multiple sets of things based on which browser. Like ideally, every browser should have whatever the optimized version for that browser. Right. I mean, assuming, but that's like the idealistic scenario where you don't have to worry about like caching and like stuff or bugs in Babel too.
And Babel has no idea what your setup is, right? It's generally run as a tool that's deeper in the chain than that.
So we just assume one build.
Yeah, so it means that when you say I want to do a JavaScript bundle that supports current versions of Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and Edge, and IE11, you might as well have just written IE11.
Right.
Because that's pretty much,
that's
whatever the lowest common denominator is your governor.
Yeah, so that's just a thing that I decided that made sense, but it has certain implications. So that's an issue if, you're always stuck supporting IE11, you don't take any advantages from that.
And so that's if your browser's list never changes. The other one is if your browser's list does change, or if you're doing bundles that support different grades of browser support. So you're going back to that what a product or program manager might give you, that browser support matrix. If you have like A, B, and C grade support, you're doing multiple bundles. Your lowest common denominators for each of those bundles may shift, but you're still always going to have one. And that's where we get into sort of the mechanics of how preset-env works. Preset-env is backed by browser compat data, but it would be somewhat unruly to take, thousands of browser compat tests with names that test specific details of each syntax feature and match them up with a, corresponding set of 1,000 Babel transforms that transform those exact syntax features. Because, you can imagine...
every bug and every... Oh, man. Every line in your code is associated with some test or something.
Yeah, literally.
And it's a bunch of if statements everywhere.
And it also assumes that there's test coverage for 100% of a feature, right?
Which is why we have some reason to use test 262, which is the official test, which is there are literally 10,000, thousands of tests.
If it passed test 262, it's valid in JavaScript.
But then that in itself, test 262 is just tests by the committee. And someone has to create those. So they can actually miss tests. And some of our team members have actually added tests because, we found something. That's a whole scenario in itself. How do you come up with a test to test your language feature?
Right.
That's
in the language.
Weird meta thing. I've talked to some people that work on it. Like Leo, he was saying they have generative tests. So they create code that will create more tests for them. And that becomes the test for this feature. Whoa. Because in the end, that's why that's an argument against adding syntax, and why maybe at the extreme level, Lisp type stuff is good because it's just the parentheses and you create your own thing. You create the macro system, all that stuff. And then with us, every time you add a feature, you have to test against every other interaction with every other feature to make sure it breaks. Yeah. And so our tests become impossible to do. And, a lot of our tests about, this is more inside baseball, but we use snapshot tests, essentially. We call them fixtures. It's just input, output, right? And make sure they're the same. But that doesn't mean it runs. And so we need executable tests. And those are the test 262 tests.
Right.
Those take longer to write, they take longer to run, but at least you can verify. But the problem with the snapshot test is, you just kind of skim through it and there's lots of them. You don't know if they're wrong.
Well, and so this actually comes back to the problem that I kind of stumbled onto in preset-env, which is every once in a while you have preset-env doing something that looks absolutely logical, right? Preset-env is going to generate, or it would have generated an arrow function inside of a class constructor, which, for a given browser support target looks like it is absolutely good to go.
Right.
And then later on, a bug report gets opened on Babel repo saying, hey, this syntax is supposed to be valid in Safari 10, or in the version of JSC that supports Safari 10.
Right.
But as it turns out, when you run it, it throws. And so in a specific example, any arrow function inside of a class definition throws in Safari 10. And that's where it's someone on the Babel team would have had to run into this bug in order to know that, in order to put that in the data that powers preset-env. And ironically, there's sort of a weird play here where it's you're probably not going to run into the bug because you were transpiling before this became an option.
So we need... it's just we need tests where you compile all the way down and then every level in between. And then, ideally we have some sort of funding from companies that allow us to run all outputs for all browsers or something.
Every test 262 test in every Babel output configuration, or every preset-env output configuration in every browser. And then literally you could take that data, suck it back into preset-env and say, I can guarantee you that test 262 passes with this configuration in Safari 10.
Right. And there's a lot of complexity, and it's why do we even do all this anymore?
There's lots of people out there who say, oh, okay, this is the reason why we shouldn't transpile.
Right.
It's just just write code, and if browsers can't run it, then that's their browser's fault. But I think this is where the situation gets really awkward. Is there are lots of browsers out there that are just never going to be updated, right? There's newer versions of those browsers that are actively developed, but the ones that are released are end of life, and taking the stance of not transpiling sort of punts the problem onto the shoulders of developers who just want to ship a product.
I mean, that's the core question of Babel should be basically, am I allowed to write this syntax?
Right.
Or when is it okay to write this syntax? Exactly. And it doesn't have to be like, is it physically possible to do it in the browser? It might not be efficient or it's not optimized because the browsers have to take time to implement it and it pass the test, but then the transpile version is faster or something.
Which we have absolutely seen in the past, right? Because especially like a brand new syntax feature in a JavaScript engine is rarely going to have all the optimizations of the thing that it is usurping. Right,
because the things that are optimized now are things that we've been writing for like 5-10 years.
Totally, and they've been incentivized for optimization for those 5 to 10 years. Yeah. I also think it's interesting to look at the let's not transpile thing. Because for me, especially having gone through the whole preset-env, preset-modules thing, I mean, I didn't know that an arrow function inside of a class constructor threw in Safari 10.
Yeah.
And I'm a person who might have considered writing untranspiled code, but I'm never going to find out that that's broken. I'm just going to not get usage in that browser anymore.
Right.
And like, unless I'm maniacally studying my error logs and figured out that the weird cryptic error that I maybe wouldn't even get in my tracking meant that there was an arrow function in class, I'm just never going to know this.
So I guess even if you don't transpile, the data that we get from transpiling actually helps everyone.
Yeah, we need the centralized knowledge of what works and what doesn't.
Right.
And I think it's more specific than just testing, does a browser support arrow functions?
Right, what does it mean to support, like what does that mean?
Does it support them everywhere?
Yeah. In every scenario, or is it just the basic case, or does it just pass the syntax, like it doesn't error, but then when you run it, it fails. Like there's so many scenarios, and even compatible is just a simplified version of what
it's a window into that browser support. Like the weird one I'm thinking of is like Edge 16 passes almost every test for functions and arrow functions you can think of, but has this one weird thing where like if you define an arrow function like const foo equals an arrow function, the .name property on that arrow function won't be foo. It will be undefined.
Right.
And for the 99% case, for if you're a developer, you don't care.
Yeah.
You're not using the .name property on the arrow function, right?
Or like, what is name? They don't even know what name is.
But then from Babel's perspective,
exactly.
Do we bring in the arrow function transform?
Right. So that's the scenario where I've always had the struggle of, we need a default, and then do we have options? So this is loose
versus strict.
Yeah, this is the whole like loose, strict, and then
write in if you know what loose and strict mode mean. You may be the only one.
And it's like, is the default that we should output the simplest thing possible because 99% of people will only write that code, or should we be spec compliant because someone's going to write something weird, not weird, but like different, not the 1% thing, and it would be weird for them to like be like, why is this not working?
Right. If Babel said you can use arrow functions, and 99 people say, okay, that's cool, I can use my arrow functions as callbacks, and it works totally fine for them. But one person said, no, I can't. They don't have a name property,
and that's in the spec or something.
Yeah, exactly. It's like Or I'm running something on my code that optimizes all of my anonymous functions to be arrow functions, and I'm relying on names somewhere.
Right, like minification too.
Oops.
Right, or optimization.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like, how spec compliant should you be? Is that, I mean, you would think that should be a goal, but then also like there's certain trade-offs.
There's huge trade-offs, right? The one is like you end up shoveling boatloads of code into people's bundles to fix problems they don't have.
Right.
Because we don't know what problems they have.
And then so it's like, are we okay with kind of catering to the majority group?
Right.
Or this, the more spec compliant thing, but then, I mean, maybe that's similar to the progressive enhancement versus, was it graceful degradation?
Graceful degradation.
Sort of.
Yeah. It's almost like you access the .name property. If there was some way we could catch that and say like, hey, turn on strict mode. We've got you covered.
Yeah. That was another idea I was like, we should analyze the output or how they use it, and then Babel will be smart enough to suggest, hey, if you don't need this, you can save this much space or something.
The awkward thing here is, and this is true for a lot of AST-based stuff, is like, you probably wouldn't know from the AST that dot name property was being accessed on the function. Certainly not if you're running the AST
the
per
static
module.
way of analyzing.
Yeah, static analysis won't necessarily be enough. And like, there's options there. Let's say Babel was a project that was doing more than per module transforms. You could have like a dev mode, and in dev mode, arrow functions that got transformed would have a getter install in the name property, and if you tried to access it at runtime, it would throw or tell you you're not interested.
Right.
Like, there's solutions there. But every time you sort of take a step towards being helpful, you might cross a boundary of like, that's not how people are using Babel.
Right.
Or that assumes too much about their end result. That assumes there's a dev mode and a prod mode. Maybe that's not a thing people are doing.
Right, I don't know. And so then, not knowing which one to lean toward, you decide maybe, I'm going to go with, this is like most life now, options.
Yep.
Give everyone the freedom, the choice to do it, and then you realize that that's a really bad idea because no one wants to know. No one knows the answer. They don't know what they want. And it's like people want you to choose for them in some sense.
Well, and so, especially for preset-env, we've said, give us your browser's list and we'll give you the code that works.
Right.
And the options are essentially an admission that, like, we can't.
Yeah.
Right? Unless everything is going to be in strict mode by default and we're taking the trade-off to one extreme, we can't commit to saying that this code will run in every browser you say. Because I don't think developers, if they were forced to make that decision, would make that call every time.
Mm-hmm.
I think they would go for a middle ground.
Yeah.
I certainly do. I mean, I'm a loose mode user, so I go like, just give me whatever's the smallest. But
yeah, I think the general thing I would say was like, if you're a library author, you can probably confidently use loose mode, but if you're an app, maybe not as much.
If you have ever looked at your output, especially if you consistently look at your output, by all means, turn on loose mode, and if it works, use it.
Right.
Especially if you have error monitoring and stuff in place. Like, it is an option that's there for a reason.
Yeah.
I think where that gets tricky is if you don't have good test coverage.
Yeah, because then what happens is you use loose mode and then that will turn off the transform, but you were relying on the loose mode behavior and the native version is spec compliant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you end up building code that only works when it's broken.
Right. and I guess, this gets me to think about like just optimization in general and like, is it worth it? Because if you think about stuff like, like C compilers and how like the output has nothing to do with the input because of the optimization, and those have bugs, and we see this problem in minifiers where like it becomes unreadable, and then it's really hard to debug a minifier because it just says broken and then like the giant bundle and like, there's almost impossible to find out.
Line 0 character 65,010.
And so part of me is like, you need to make a judgment call on what kind of optimizations are worth. It's kind of like the whole micro optimization. It's like, it's not worth doing it because it's just making it really complicated, and we're like making this assumption that we're never gonna write bugs, and it's like we need to almost write code knowing that we will introduce bugs, and the whole like the more code you have, the more bugs.
Yeah, sacrificing debugability in order to have optimizations is.
Right, I guess that's the implicit trade-off that we don't think about much.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was a whole tangent again. But I guess we mentioned this already, I guess, but the point is that if the browsers that we are in our targets, those are not updated, and then people report bugs in those browsers, and we did, okay, so there wasn't a tangent. We talked about the spec compliant thing. So and I think that's our approach, where if someone reports a bug, should we fix it, basically? Right. And so, I think in most scenarios, if you're just open source maintainer, you'll fix the bug. But then in our case, what we're doing is we're admitting by fixing that bug, we have to decrease the target of that browser. Right. And so now everyone that has that browser is now outputting more code, even though they're not running into that issue. Right.
And it's also difficult to bring the marketing along with that. So, like, somebody coming to preset-env, when they look at what does preset-env do, the idea of preset-env, which is still largely intact, is it will output the most minimal code possible for your browser support set. But with each quirky bug that gets reported, we get a little bit further from that goal.
Yeah, we actually decrease over time, just like really slowly, and then we don't really tell anyone, I guess. You don't really notice that. And I never noticed that. So you're like, oh yeah, I'll fix a bug. And then but then when you look at the real world output of the code, you're like, why why is in the worst case scenario that preset-env output is the same thing as if you just ran all of it with Babel?
Yeah, and so this is exactly where my journey with preset modules kind of started.
Right.
Was I was doing a bunch of work on module no module builds, which for those that don't know is you write or you create two bundles in your compile process. One that is targeted at the group of modern browsers that support ES modules.
Right.
And to clarify, you are not using ES modules, you're just using that as a cutoff point. It's roughly analogous to Edge 16, Chrome 60, Firefox 61, and Safari 10.1 on mobile or 10.3 on desktop. Why do I remember that?
I don't even remember it.
Yeah. But it's just essentially like, oh, okay, those are the ones that support modules. And there's a convenient thing where you can have a script type equals module, stick your modern script there, and then script no module, stick your legacy script there. And you don't have to do any work, you just get loading for old browsers and new browsers.
Because the browser ignores the...
Yeah, it ignores no module. If it supports module, it ignores type module if it supports... if it doesn't support.
You have two script tags where one of them runs, basically.
Basically, yeah. And there's weird little caveats. You need a little hack at the top of your file to work around it in Safari. But by and large, this is sort of the easiest way to do graded browser support as long as you're okay with two grades.
And that's kind of like a practical step instead of the whole matrix of every browser
the user
deserves...
agent.
Yeah, figure out the user agent and then make a Babel compile for each one.
Yeah.
This is kind of like, we'll just do two.
Right.
And I guess the thing that you found was that in some cases, no module and module, the two bundles were basically similar.
Yeah, I had cases where they were byte for byte identical, which was weird that we just weren't using constant let. But what I found was like some of the absolute highest value transforms that preset-env could be dropping when you think of just like modern Chrome, Firefox, and Safari.
Async. Yeah,
async await generators, tag templates, like all these things are like the modern version of those things are like super optimized, fast to parse, smaller in general, better, they compress better. I kept finding that all of those were being compiled to ES5. Right. So tag templates were getting compiled to strings and function calls, and async await was getting compiled to regenerator, which is obviously quite high cost. And it sort of this kept coming up over and over again. And originally I just thought it was like people have misconfigured preset-env.
Right.
But eventually I sort of...
Deeper.
Like I had seen it. This was what happened. It was just in core. So eventually I started digging and found that over the course of 2 or 3 years, a bunch of bugs had been opened, kind of what we described. It was like I ran into this issue where I converted over to using arrow functions, and when I use Babel, my arrow functions in almost all browsers have a .name property except for Edge 16. Or more difficult, people would say, oh, I'm using preset-env with the ES modules option, which outputs sort of this Edge 16 plus build. And I keep getting this error where there's like a weird exception thrown every time I instantiate a class that has an arrow function inside of it.
So it's just like all those edge cases, and if I think back, like I remember some of them, but it's just like, oh, I mean, and also when you hear stuff like that, it's like,
that's weird.
Why, that's weird. I don't really want to fix it,
yeah.
But I mean, it's a problem for them, and maybe none of the team focused on it, and someone else, maybe they decide to fix it, and we're like, well, of course, we'll just merge it in.
Yeah.
And then that leads to this problem of what you were describing. And the one I do remember was there's something about, I forgot which browser, about there was like, it was in a for loop. And it only happened.
Safari.
It only happened when the for loop was over 100,000 or 1 million. And I was like, when is that ever going to happen? And then we ended up merging that fix, and I'm just like, we just made the code way bigger for all these people. I'm just like, why did we do that?
Yeah, so tag template call site tracking in Safari 10 and 11 has 2 different weird bugs that get triggered at various states of optimization.
Right, that makes sense. That would be an optimization thing.
Yeah, but it's like, how do you test for that? Like, oh, the code has to get hot and then jitted. It's like, what? So as it turns out, foreshadowing here, when I did preset modules, I had to write a test for this. I found a way. You can mock the call site using bind, and that happens to trigger this bug. It doesn't trigger it the way that it was happening in the wild in the bug report, but it triggers the bug.
Wow.
But it was just like, crap. I think Justin, the guy who wrote lit.html, found that because it uses tag templates.
Oh, right.
And the problem was like the outcome of it was disastrous. Right, the tag template is always supposed to give you the same reference to an array of strings every time you call it, and this is super useful for caching. Right? You can store stuff in there or use it as a key in a map. And in Safari, it didn't. It just gave you a new one every time. Or a second bug that I found when I was going through that wasn't even documented anywhere was Safari did an earlier version of the tag template spec, and if you had two different call sites inside of the same parent function, they would get the same strings array, but they're different call sites, so they could have like different expressions in them, which was just like, I can't imagine being somebody who was relying on tag template caching and being like,
yeah.
And so literally you have a bunch of libraries now, even stepping aside the Babel problem here, you have a bunch of libraries now that implement their own tag template call site tracking
right.
because the cache is not reliable, and it just came down to this one browser bug.
Yeah, I think the general thing is just browsers have bugs.
Yeah, and that will always be the case.
And it's hard to acknowledge that, and what are the implications of what that means.
And each individual bug that gets reported is like, it's a small thing.
Right.
Just tweak the data. And preset-env is actually really well designed in that, like, it takes 2 seconds to change the data definition and recompile. It's like, okay, yeah, non-trivial, whatever. But it sort of buries the lead on the fact. It's like, this is a huge de-optimization.
Right. Because what we'll do is, like, if it's Chrome 50 and now Chrome 49, it's like, the config change is good, but then I guess we don't see the input-output relationship when we change Babel that way.
Right.
Okay, so basically the summary for that is that when browsers have bugs, Babel has to fix those bugs. That causes greater output for most people because they don't hit those bugs.
Right.
And so basically over time, preset-env gets worse. And this is just like abstractly like it gets worse. Like maybe it doesn't affect you at all. It might affect you a lot.
Right.
So then what is our way forward with that?
Right, yeah. So this is, having sort of seen the bundles, work back from this, I started to realize that like a lot of these bugs, we have sort of an out here, which is that the bug is in a browser that has very good support for the syntax in question, except for
that one case.
X, right? And so there's a bunch of cases, like I started to just catalog in a gist, as sort of like, I found this thing, and there was only 5 or 6 like really specific pain points that had been logged to Babel or discussed online. And in cataloging them, pretty much all of them, when I looked at them like as a unit, I could go through and write syntax transforms that instead of taking a tag template and transpiling it to
all
strings,
the way.
Yeah, like instead of ES5, I could just take the tag template and change the tag function to something that fixes the call site caching. Which would be like a little like
a small
50-byte helper function, right? And then I've now shipped tag templates in production,
right?
But they work in Safari, or like the async await thing. I'm trying to remember what it was. It was an async arrow function inside of a class is the one that causes this error when you instantiate the class. So you just turn the arrow function into a function, which Babel already has literally a built-in method to do. It's a one-line transform. Just say make it a function.
Okay, yeah.
And the cost of that versus changing the arrow to regenerator is like
a lot.
Night and day,
Not
right?
even close, yeah.
It's like if it didn't use the this keyword or touch arguments, it's almost identical.
So it's kind of like finding these little like patches that you can,
yeah.
And then you already able to kind of picture like, I could just make a bunch of plugins, and then say, maybe that could be a preset. Yeah. So I think this whole thing is a very natural like evolution of observing the environment and then evaluating the results and then coming up with some ideas and eventually telling us like, hey, maybe we should work on
this. It's just difficult, and this is where I understand preset-env here. It's difficult if you've been working in the model that preset-env enabled to take a step back and say, wait, could we do patching?
Yeah. Right?
Is this completely different approach either something that we can do or something that we can incorporate or whatever? When you have so much great infrastructure set up around that exact way of doing the conditional down leveling.
Right, and I think that when I saw those kind of issues, I was just like, how do we fix this? I just kind of
do you fix it by starting a fundamentally new project?
Right.
Probably not.
Yeah. Right, and so this is what that is, Babel preset modules. But and we had a discussion on what to name it, and that was very difficult, and that's
why we keep getting it wrong.
I mean, like, modules, like, because then I think the first thing would be, it compiles modules.
Yeah, doesn't. Has nothing to do with modules.
Right. It has something to do with ES modules.
Yeah.
And then
there's no modules transforms.
Yeah. Right, because it's patches.
Yeah.
So we're gonna call it like Babel preset fix browser bugs or something like that.
Try and go as literal as humanly possible, right? Like an Apple length method name.
And I think the fact that it's really hard to come up with a name shows that this doesn't need to be a thing. And so yes, so maybe I think we already described the preset. It's a bunch of bug fixes in the form of Babel plugins that transform the code in a way that isn't like the whole transform, right? It's like the smallest possible changed to fix the browser bug, essentially.
Yeah. And there's a transform to fix the function.name property, there's a transform to fix the tag templates, call site tracking issue in Safari. And if you just look at the transform names, it's like fix tag templates caching, fix arrow functions in class constructors in Safari. And they are laser focused fixes for those things. And you compare that to the transform names in preset-env and Babel, which is like transform tag templates.
Right.
To what, right? Yeah. And so it's a collection of transforms that they just do the patching. Mm-hmm. And so I think the curious bit here is sort of there was a marketing premise here that it does fulfill, which is if you are doing a compile that is targeting ES modules supporting browsers, this is the minimum number of transforms required in order to reliably ship that code as modern code. But the problem is, like, if everybody were to migrate from preset-env to this transform is just stuck in time.
Right.
Because it doesn't fix bugs that are in Chrome 90, which, if anybody's not familiar with Chrome version numbers, that won't happen for another few years. Those bugs haven't even been written yet.
That's so funny.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, and so what you don't want to do is like pitch this, and then it's the new 6 to 5.
Right.
And we regress all the way back to the beginning.
Because this is a one-time snapshot in time. And I think preset-env was supposed to be also for Babel, like a way to transition. So we need this approach to be able to transition. Right. And so it's not really literally this preset that matters, it's the idea behind it and how to somehow integrate this back into Babel itself, which maybe in this case is just preset-env. And so maybe what we decided was just that we want people to get the benefits now, and then we get feedback, maybe we're doing something wrong, and over time we need to figure out how to basically patch preset-env.
Right. And I mean, right now, you and I talked about like those browser support cliffs that we have crossed. Mm-hmm. The ES modules browser support target remains a pretty good one because that's a pretty modern set of browsers, right? You're talking 88% market share and fairly recent browsers. The further we go into the future, the less true that will be. Eventually, ECMAScript 50 will come out and it will have AI functions or whatever. And I'm trying to make up something completely implausible, but like that will be a cliff where it would be so illogical to be using a preset that was written in 2019 that couldn't self-evolve, that you would have to use something else. And so I think this is where like there needs to be some sort of a path for preset modules to move back into Babel core and just become a behind-the-scenes feature that we had talked about this in the Babel meeting, where like when we look at the compat data, we would take the browser compat data and apply the patches, like overlaid that we know we have, right? Like, oh yeah, we know tag templates are busted in Safari 10, but we got a patch for that. So don't consider them broken in Safari 10 because our output will account for that. Mm-hmm. And then we calculate the browser support matrix.
Right.
And it would be in the project's best interest and in all of our best interest to make sure that we are trying to contribute as much as possible into that patch substrate so that we can keep that baseline moving forward as best as we can.
Right.
And the interesting thing is there is prior art for this. Babel's code generator always wraps, I'm trying to remember what the exact thing is. I think it's await expressions in parens to fix a Safari bug. And it's like, okay, so this has been done in the past, right? That's not an option.
I didn't even realize that.
Yeah, it was like there was a bug at one point, and it's such a cheap operation to do.
Just
like
do it for everything.
Done, right?
Oh wow.
And in that regard, Babel has never had to be like, oh, we can't use async await in Safari because of the parens thing. So there's prior art there.
Okay.
I think the interesting thing is just how does that scale up?
Right, because essentially what we're asking for now is a process change for Babel as a project.
Right.
To essentially add these things. And then it sounds like it's sort of, I thought that was kind of like what jQuery was doing too, right? It wasn't, people talk about like query selector and stuff, but it also did fix browser bugs, right?
Right.
And kind of give you this API so that it just works across all browsers. And so we're kind of doing that with syntax. So it's not just the browsers implementing it, but implementing wrong and then needing to like fix.
Yeah, and for Babel, the key there would be whatever infrastructure gets put in place to apply these patches, it needs to be such that if you're using preset-env and you define your browser support target to be Safari 12+, you shouldn't get that tag templates transform.
Right.
We want it to be there by default when you need it, but not when you don't.
Yeah. I think that's a good explanation. So, let's see. And yeah, I think how would you describe this scenario all the way down, right? It's like, you know, I mean, we already mentioned it, but like, there's a whole path for this whole thing, right? Like, you know, the proposal for the future, and then it gets standardized, and then it gets implemented in Babel, and then it gets implemented in browser, and then there's a bug in browser.
Right.
Then, you know, the browser bug, is that reported? It could have been reported to the browser directly. Right. And then we don't know about it, and then eventually someone reports it to us, and then we have to create the patch for it, and then, you know, that whole thing. Like, how does that work? Because, like, right now, everything's just so ad hoc. And
like, I had to, my list of bugs was a mix of WebKit Tracker, Chrome Tracker, and Babel issues. And, like, very few of them had both.
Yeah.
Which was interesting, because it's like, okay, at some point, it doesn't matter what happens, somebody who needs to know about this isn't going to. and the interesting thing is, like, Babel actually is not even the maintainer of that compat data.
No.
And it wasn't reported through the compat data. And because it's like, who is going to be a Babel, or like a web developer using Babel, running code in a browser, but then know to report it over at
all these
the Kangax compat table data source, right? Like, how do you get there?
Yeah, we need a coordination effort. Or, like, I mean, that's why I feel like we don't, I mean, not that we need to make our own table. I mean, maybe we do, and we have a real reason to do that if for the interest of our project. Yeah. Unlike basically every other tool, because maybe I thought for a lot of people the compat table was just like a nice thing to look at. Mm-hmm. You can make decisions for it, but like for us, it's literally the data to make this work.
It's what you would have written as code.
Right, it is code for us. Yeah. And so we need, like, for other people, it's okay if it's kind of wrong. It's like, no, it has to be right then.
Yeah. And for Babel's purposes, I mean, you could make an argument that it would be nice to have that data in-house so that it can be mutated when fixes are produced.
Right. Or just like, at least it works in a way that we can manipulate. And I would love to not maintain more stuff. I would love to not have to recreate anything either. It's just like, can we work together to do that kind of thing?
And then bringing in the whole test 262 thing, it's like, how do we... Does Babel do the work of meshing all this data together, or do we just need a centralized place for this data?
Right. Yeah.
Because there's also the reporting aspect. Like, if I'm a developer using Babel, it might be that's the most logical place for me to go and file a bug. But, like, does Babel then go and file that bug with the browser engine?
Like, do we make a bot that does it? You know, I don't know. Like,
who's maintaining that infrastructure?
Nobody.
Yeah.
Cool. I think that basically covers all that. Maybe you could mention all these last parts. What about this first bullet point?
I wrote this, and I don't remember what I was thinking. Oh, yeah.
Literally just...
Yeah, so this was just, you know, we published Babel preset-modules as its own independent thing. You can install it, download it, NPM. Some projects are already using it. If you have a module, no module build setup, if you are experimenting down this is one of the reasons why it's its own thing right now, is like, more people need to do module, no module. We want to make it easier. If you are in that position, if you're maintaining one or want to maintain one, please try it. Please let us or let me know on file issues, whatever.
Yep.
Understand that long term we would love for this to migrate back into preset-env. Thankfully for you, really that's just a configuration change, so it's super, super minimal overhead, and you can try the things out today. Mm-hmm. But yeah, definitely very interested in feedback, interested if you get any exceptions thrown. So if you have production error monitoring, I want to know.
Yeah. What projects are using it now?
Next.js ships it, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. And then, let's see. Okay, so I think that we basically went over, like, why we're working on this. Yeah, the future of that. I did post a thing on Twitter on if people had other questions of things we should talk about. Or maybe, I guess, I don't think we're going to go over them, but we can mention them. And maybe they can be, they're probably going to be future episodes because they require a whole different topic, I think. Especially, like, Vincent, a lot of other people were asking about compiling Node modules. So, yeah.
Something. Try running Babel on your output. Yeah, maybe topic for a second podcast.
Yeah, and also when we have more to say about that, I guess.
Yes.
What was another one?
Vincent, it was on the outline.
Probably on your outline, yeah.
It was on our outline to put in the second podcast.
I mean, there's a lot, yeah.
Yeah, it's a super interesting area, and I certainly in my own head I've made a very compelling argument for running Babel twice.
I mean, I think you've written like at least 2 or 3 blog posts, and I wrote one a long time ago.
Those are just the public blog posts. You should see the stuff I've pitched at people internally. But yeah,
like how do we get library authors to... I mean, so basically, all the problems we're talking about now are your own code.
Right.
And then it's like, wait, a lot of the code that we run and we ship is not even the code you wrote. It's libraries. And they are all on ES5, and we have this whole other problem, including this problem.
Yeah. What if it's too late? Right, like quite literally, what if all the code that you're passing to Babel is already transpiled to ES5? Does anything matter?
Does it even matter? Why are you even worrying about your own code?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good teaser for the next...
Yeah. Find out next on the Babel Podcast.
Yeah. I think that's good then.
Cool.
Awesome. Thanks. This is really great. I don't know.
Now we get to find out if